everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. Once again, I find myself on a long drive car day. In fact, I'm probably going to be doing about 120 to 130 miles today in a round trip. So I figured it'd be a good time to kick on the camera and have another chat about some current issues. The one I want to tackle today is kind of a big one in the automotive community, and that is whether or not we should save the manual transmissions. Now, this was a big deal a little while ago. There was t-shirts and stickers and hats that all said save the manual transmissions, and the movement kind of got quiet or died out for a while. However, recently it's been brought back to attention because Toyota has announced that their BMW Supra is going to be coming with a manual transmission. Now, this is something people have been asking for since it came out, and it was really confusing why this wasn't an option, because the Z4 Roadster from BMW, which is literally the exact same car with a different body, has an automatic and a manual option. So why didn't the Toyota version of it not have a manual? So it's finally getting a manual transmission, which is great. Also, the new Z car, everybody was super excited to see that it didn't come with a DCT. You could either get an automatic transmission or a manual transmission. So once again, we're seeing a move towards revitalizing manual transmissions. So the question is, though, with technology nowadays, does that really need to happen? However, before I get to answering that question, two things. One, if you'd like to see more automotive, particularly GTR content in the future, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And two, if you'd like to support the channel, I do have the JD Archer shop. If you go to jdarcher.bigcartel.com, you can see a limited section of t-shirts I've designed that are for sale, and there is a new design up there. For those of you that have been following either my Facebook page or Instagram or YouTube posts, you know I've been working to convert my buddy Mike's Bayside Blue R32 Nissan Skyline GTR into kind of a animation style avatar, and I finished. And I've now put it on a t-shirt with the backdrop of the rising sun of Japan with the Tokyo skyline, and it's for sale now. I have a version where the print's on the front, or you can get a version where the print's on the back, whichever you prefer. But with that out of the way, let's attempt to answer the question, do we really need to save the manual transmissions? I'd like to start this video by explaining why I personally kind of have a preference for manual transmissions. And I think it goes all the way back to the time when my dad used to take me to car shows when I was a little kid. And I remember always he would see a car that he would be like really excited about, like a 69 Camaro or a fastback Mustang or a 1950s Ford F-150. And of course we'd go over and check the car out. And one of the things he'd do is he'd look through the driver's window, and if he saw an automatic transmission, he'd always make this comment like, oh, it's just an automatic. As if for some reason, the fact that the car had an automatic transmission made it not a car. Or it made this car that he absolutely loves and was maybe a dream car of his, not even really worthy. And I think that just kind of got ingrained in me early on, to the point where even I have that mentality. If the car doesn't have a manual, it's not really worth it. And that would explain why every car I've owned, really, except for this car, has had a manual transmission. And I've made active efforts to stay away from anything that had an automatic. So I think for a lot of us, we might have had the same beginnings where, you know, we grew up with a parent who was a bit of a wrench head, and coming from the 60s and the 70s, they have that mentality where if it doesn't have a manual transmission, it's not a real car. Having said all that, the next thing I want to do is explore why my father, or whatever wrench head introduced you to cars, had that particular mentality. And I think it goes back to the cars that they were building when they were younger. For my dad, he was into cars when he was in the late 60s, early 70s. And back then, automatic transmissions were just extremely inefficient. I mean, back in the day, you'd have an automatic transmission and it was run off of a torque converter, and gears were kind of selected by vacuum tubes. So they didn't have the computers that we had nowadays that makes automatic a little bit better, because nowadays with computers, you can tune your automatic transmission for either fuel efficiency or for performance. And sometimes you even have gear selections on that where you can choose your mode of the day. Back then, they didn't have that. It was literally just the vacuum tubes, the torque converter, and that was it. So in that, they were a very inefficient system. Not only that, but with an automatic transmission, you were limited on your gears back in the day. Now, this is kind of flip-flopped in modern times. So back in the day, you could get a manual transmission, you could get a 4 or a 5 speed depending on the year. But with an automatic, you really were limited to basically 3 or 4 gears max. And having that extra gear on a manual meant you could get more top end speed. Nowadays, this actually has kind of flip-flopped where it seems like most manual transmissions are limited to 6, but man, you can get some automatic transmissions that have got like 9 gears. So in that philosophy is kind of flip-flop, but like I said, they grew up with those cars. That's probably why they have that mentality. Another reason why they probably preferred manuals over automatics was gear selection. So if you think about it, a manual is built for driver gear selection. The clutch is where it should be, and the gear selector is usually in a very easy place for the driver to reach. Whereas with an automatic, you really didn't get that because they expected you to just put the car in drive and go. Now, yes, automatics back in the day, you could select, drive, third, second, or first, but it wasn't an easy or precise thing to do because you either had the shifter on the stock, or in the case of my 69 Camaro, which was the only other automatic car I've ever owned, it was where the gear selector usually was, but it was kind of a rectangular piece. It had a lockout they had to pull, and it was very notchy. And in that, it was very easy if I was trying to downshift from drive to third, to miss third and go to second because it just was notchy and go too far. So in that, if you wanted to select gears, it was much more easy to select the gear you want in a manual transmission. Not only that, the issue that you're going to have with an automatic transmission over a manual is that automatic transmissions are sequential. You can't just go from fourth to second like you can with a manual transmission. You have to hit all gears. So if I was in an automatic transmission and I wanted to go from fourth to second because I'm either on a track or a canyon and there's a sharp corner coming up, I would have to go from fourth to third to second. Where with a manual transmission, you just go from fourth to second instantly and it's done. So I think that's a large reason why I think that at least my father and the older generation have the feelings they do about manuals versus automatic, because back in the day, if you wanted to be competitive, you couldn't do that with an automatic transmission. And then of course, building off of that, I think there's the ego that comes with driving a manual transmission. So because people that were more performance-based back in the day would have to get a manual to be competitive, and people that pretty much just used a car to get from point A to point B were more than happy to buy an automatic, I think there was a bit of a prestige that came from people that could drive manuals. And I think that mentality is also carried all the way through today. I gotta admit, I kind of have it. If you don't know how to drive a manual transmission, I really don't look at you as much of a competitive driver if you say, oh, I only know how to drive an automatic. If you're like, oh yeah, I can slam gears in a manual, I kind of take you more seriously as a driver. And I think there again, it comes back to back in the day, nobody that was a serious driver would buy an automatic because there was no gain from it. So in that, I think that also kind of puts forth the need why people want to save the manual, because they feel like you're not a real driver unless you know how to drive a manual. Having said all that and explained, where maybe the mystique of why a manual is better than an automatic came from and why our mentality is still there, I want to explore if whether or not those thought processes might be out of date. It might be better to actually run an automatic. And I'll never forget the first time that this thought even occurred to me, because it was a real slap in the face, is while I was working in Hollywood, and whenever I was on set, if we had precision or stunt drivers, I would always go talk to them because, well, we obviously had the same passion. They would be able to tell me these hints and tricks and give me techniques. And after a while, some of them even started giving me jobs as a precision driver in like commercials. It was great. It was a lot of fun. I loved doing it. But one of the things that shocked me right off the bat with my first conversation with a stunt driver is how he hated manual transmissions. And my first response was like, well, wait, you're a real car person, at least in my mind, somebody who drives for Hollywood, does precision and stunt. You're a real car person. What do you mean you don't like manual transmissions? And he explained to me that when you're driving for Hollywood, there's so much stuff going on that distracts you that a manual transmission is just one more thing that you have to keep track of that you just don't want to have to worry about. If you're having to worry about doing a slide or a rollover, or you need to stop the car on a very specific mark, you don't want to have to worry about, selecting the right gear, making sure the clutch is in or whatever to make sure you don't stall. It's just one more thing that you could do wrong to mess up a take, and then you have to go again. which when you start doing multiple takes tends to piss off the people in charge because it costs them money. So that was my first real experience with like, maybe in at least some situations, automatics are better than manuals. Now that we've determined that automatic transmissions are actually better in certain circumstances, I want to take a look at automatic transmissions, the technology of today versus the manual. And it really has started to seem like that the technology has gotten to the point where, yeah, the automatics have made the manuals obsolete. And the reason for this is a few things. As I said earlier, back in the day, automatic transmissions were limited to only 3 or 4 gears. Nowadays, that is not the case at all. When I'm seeing automatic transmissions with up to 9 gears, that means that you can have a more linear acceleration, you can have a higher top end speed because it's more efficient to get to that smaller gear without losing the torque, that you can actually have a faster car with an automatic than you can with a manual. And we've also managed to get rid of that issue with the shifting where it's very clunky to shift gears in an automatic, because now, like I said, you can either have bump shift modes, which most cars do, or even more of them even have paddle shifters. So you can select your gears quicker and more efficient without worrying about missing something. So in that is actually faster because you don't have time on the clutch. Now, I also want to talk about another type of transmission, and I'm going to kind of consider it an automatic, even though it's not really an automatic, and that's dual clutch transmissions, or DCTs, which is what's in the R35 GTR. In essence, it's still a manual transmission, but it's a computer-controlled manual transmission. And the reason why the R35 GTR never came with a standard manual transmission was when you use launch control on this car, it accelerates so quick that the designers of the car discovered that no human could shift fast enough to keep up with the car. So in that, technology for automatic transmissions has gotten so good that it's in essence made the human obsolete. And if you try to run a manual transmission in some of these cars, you're actually going to run slower because you just don't have the reaction time. You just can't. It's not humanly possible. Now that we've gone through all of the things with the automatic transmission, especially nowadays, about how they're really just so much more efficient than they were back in the day, to the point that really the driver can't keep up with them. And if you want to drive competitively nowadays, it's almost better to have an automatic transmission than a manual, which, like I said, is complete opposite from what it was back in the day. So then the question is, should we be fighting to save the manual? Does the manual still serve a purpose? And in that, I'm going to say, yeah, the manual still does serve a purpose. Now, if you're not worried about shaving hundredths of a second off of a lap time or being the quickest around the track, then there's just something about driving a manual transmission that is just way more fun. Yes, you do feel more connected to your car when you have a manual transmission because you have more control over it personally. If pretty much I'm basically coming into a corner and I've got to brake hard, I slam the clutch down, I downshift from like 5th to 3rd to carry the proper speed through the corner, and then I basically smash the throttle coming out of the corner and shift it back into 4th. It's just something that's more fun and engaging. It doesn't feel as much like a video game sitting in your living room. It's a more visceral experience. So in that, the manual transmission definitely gives you more of a driver sensation. Not only that, but there's certain applications where you need a manual transmission. And of course, I'm thinking of drifting. Now, yes, you can drift an automatic, you just have less options. When you drift an automatic, you either have to just make sure you have enough horsepower that you can get those rear tires to break the the kinetic coefficient of friction and get them spinning, or you have to handbrake. Whereas with a manual transmission, you have a third option, which is slipping the clutch to initiate the drift. So in that, if you want to get your car sideways, having an automatic is not something you want. You really do want a manual. Another reason why you may want a manual over an automatic is actually really funny, is actually theft deterrence. And this was kind of brought to my attention. I caught a news report from up in Oregon where I used to live, and there was an old lady talking. Unfortunately, a lady had been carjacked. 3 teenagers actually came up to her at a stop sign, put a gun in her face, forced her out of the car, and tried to take her car. But the problem was they got like 2 foot down the road and stalled the car. And they started up the car and they tried to go again and stalled out, and they all then just got out of the car and ran away. And I remember the old lady, she's like, I didn't know that having a manual transmission was a theft deterrent system. And it's kind of funny because she's right. A lot of the current generation, they don't know how to drive manual. They've never learned because they've never had to. So if you have a car with a manual transmission, it's so much harder to steal because they don't know how to drive anything but automatics. So in that, it's a great reason to basically learn how to drive manual and keep them around, because it makes it harder to steal. So with all that being said, as we've seen now, there's certain advantages that the automatic has over the manual and certain advantages that the manual has over the automatic. The question is it worth saving the manual? And I've got to say, it's still a really hard question to answer. Because if you want to look at it strictly logically, the automatic is a better way to go. It's more efficient, it's faster, it's less driver error. You don't have to worry about as much when you're driving as like if you're a stunt driver. So logically, yeah, we should let the manual die. But emotionally, I don't think we can do it, because we still get that sensation. If you're not concerned about shaving 1/100th of a second off of a lap time, and you're more concerned with like taking your car out and carving up canyons and back roads, nothing beats the enjoyment of slamming gears, going on the back roads, pushing your car to the limit, seeing what you can do with the compound of the tires, and driving a manual is 100% a part of that experience. Plus, there is that ego thing. People might hate me for it, but yes, I still judge people about whether or not you can drive a manual and your ability to be a true car enthusiast. So in that, let's not forget drifting. You cannot really drift in an automatic. You need a manual, so there's a good reason to keep the manual right there also. As long as people are still attempting to get sideways with a car, we're still going to need manual transmissions. So in my opinion, do we need to save the manual transmission? The answer is yes. I would like to see the manual transmission saved, because there's all sorts of different types of drivers out there. But that being said, my opinion might be moot. Anyways, as we're having this huge push in the EV revolution, those electric cars don't run transmissions at all because the engines are right on the wheel, at which point you're not going to have a manual even if you wanted it, or even if you wanted to save it, you couldn't, because it's just not really an option. So I hope that's still years down the road, but it's where we're at. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go hit that thumbs up button to let me know. It does help the channel a lot. As I did say at the beginning of the video, if you'd like to see more automotive, particularly GTR content in the future, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on all forms of social media, which include Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. I'll leave links to all those in the description down below. After watching this video, if you have any questions or you feel there's anything I missed, or if you have an opinion about whether or not we need to save the manual and you have some reasons behind it, go ahead and post in the comment section down below. I will respond to you. I thank you all for watching. Until next time, forget everything else, focus on the finish line.